Paranormal Temple. Deep within the forgotten forest of Shyamgarh lay an ancient temple, long abandoned by time, its walls cracked, overgrown with vines, and shrouded in mystery. The temple was once a sacred place of worship, but now it was a forbidden zone, feared by the villagers who lived in its shadow. Legends told of strange occurrences surrounding the temple, eerie whispers that echoed through the trees, flickering lights in the dead of night, and a haunting presence that lurked in the darkness. The villagers had long given up any attempts to visit the temple. Anyone who entered never returned. The temple was cursed, at least that's what they believed. It wasn't just any curse, it was said that the temple had become a home to powerful spirits, ancient forces of evil that were awakened by a betrayal centuries ago. One stormy night, an outsider named Aiden arrived in Shyamgarh. He was a paranormal investigator, skeptical of the supernatural, and drawn by the stories of the Paranormal Temple. The warnings of the villagers did little to deter him. If anything, they fueled his curiosity. He believed the temple's dark reputation was exaggerated, a tale spun out of fear and folklore. With a camera in hand and a flashlight strapped to his chest, Aiden ventured into the heart of the forest. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became. The once peaceful sounds of the forest faded, replaced by an unsettling silence that gnawed at his nerves. The temple loomed ahead, bathed in shadows, its massive stone gates still intact, as though waiting for him. As Aiden crossed the threshold into the temple, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating. He switched on his flashlight, casting a narrow beam of light across the stone walls. Ancient carvings lined the walls, depicting gods and demons locked in battle, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved deeper into the structure. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. His breath fogged in front of him as the eerie whispers began. Soft at first, like a distant chant, the voices grew louder, filling the empty halls with a chorus of agonizing moans. He swung his flashlight wildly, trying to find the source, but there was no one there. The sound was everywhere, and nowhere. Aiden's heart raced as he reached the central chamber. In the middle of the room stood an altar, covered in dust, with strange, ancient symbols carved into its surface. A feeling of being watched crept over him, but when he turned around, no one was there. His skin crawled with fear as he noticed something horrifying, a faint, ghostly figure standing at the far end of the room, just beyond the reach of his light. The figure seemed to flicker in and out of existence, its face obscured, its form distorted. Aiden stumbled back, gripping his camera tightly, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Panic rose within him as the whispers became deafening, like voices screaming in his ear. He couldn't make out the words, but the message was clear: leave. But before he could flee, the doors of the temple slammed shut with a force that shook the ground. The figure began to drift closer, its shape shifting and twisting as it moved. Aiden could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, suffocating him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, the room grew dark, his flashlight flickering out. In the pitch black, he could hear something breathing, its raspy, unnatural breaths growing louder and closer. Aiden fumbled with his camera, trying to switch on the night vision. The screen flickered to life, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The figure was right in front of him now, its face mere inches from his own. Its eyes were hollow, endless pits of darkness, and its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It whispered his name, the voice low and guttural, sending chills down his spine. Aiden screamed and bolted toward the door, banging on it with all his might, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. The walls seemed to close in on him as the spirit's laughter echoed through the chamber. Desperation overtook him as the temperature dropped even further, his breath now freezing in the air. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. The door creaked open, and Aiden stumbled outside, gasping for air. But the forest wasn't the same. The once familiar trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like claws. The path back to the village had disappeared, replaced by an endless stretch of darkness. Aiden was no longer in Shyamgarh. The curse had claimed him. The temple's evil had followed him out, trapping him in a nightmare that had no escape. He looked back at the temple, its silhouette towering over him, the ghostly figure now standing at the entrance, watching him, waiting for him to return. And then, as if the night itself swallowed him, Aiden vanished, never to be seen again. To this day, the villagers of Shyamgarh warn travelers about the Paranormal Temple, telling them to stay far away, for those who enter the temple never return the same. If they return at all as Aiden vanished into the darkness, the villagers of Shyamgarh continued their lives, unaware that the curse of the Paranormal Temple had claimed yet another victim. Days turned into weeks, and soon, the whispers about Aiden's disappearance spread like wildfire through the village. No one dared to go near the forest, let alone the temple, but there was one person who couldn't stay away, Rekha. Rekha was Aiden's girlfriend. She had warned him not to go, but his obsession with the paranormal had driven him to his fate. When weeks passed with no word from him, her concern turned into desperation. She knew in her heart something terrible had happened, but the villagers refused to help her. They told her the same thing they had told Aiden. The temple is cursed, and once you enter, you don't come back. But Rekha wasn't willing to accept that. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and her determination, she set out to find the Paranormal Temple, believing she could save Aiden, or at least find out what had happened to him. The forest felt different as she walked deeper into it. The thick canopy of trees blocked out the sun, plunging the path into near darkness. The sound of her footsteps echoed unnervingly, as if someone, or something, was following her. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves sent a chill down her spine, but she pressed on, determined to reach the temple before nightfall. When she finally saw the towering gates of the Paranormal Temple through the mist, her breath caught in her throat. The temple was even more imposing than Aiden had described. Its massive stone walls were covered in ancient symbols, and the air around it felt heavy, like the temple itself was alive, watching her approach. With her heart pounding in her chest, Rekha stepped through the gates. The moment she crossed the threshold, a bone-chilling wind swept through the temple, extinguishing her flashlight. Panic set in as she fumbled to turn it back on, but the temple was already closing in around her. The eerie whispers began, just like Aiden had described, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. As she moved deeper into the temple, the whispers seemed to form words, calling out to her, beckoning her to the central chamber. The coldness in the air intensified with each step she took, until her breath was visible, forming icy clouds in front of her. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on twisted, unnatural shapes. Suddenly, a voice, clearer than the rest, echoed through the hall. Rekha. She froze, her blood running cold. It was Aiden's voice. Desperation surged within her as she called out for him. Aiden, where are you? But only silence followed. She began to run, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty corridors of the temple. The walls seemed to close in on her, as if the temple itself was shifting, twisting, trapping her within its cursed grip. When she reached the central chamber, her heart sank. In the middle of the room stood the altar, just as Aiden had described. But this time, there was something else, a figure slumped against the altar, motionless. Aiden, she whispered, her voice trembling. She approached cautiously, shining her flashlight on the figure. It was Aiden, but he wasn't the same. His eyes were vacant, his face pale and gaunt, as if the life had been drained from him. His lips moved faintly, but no sound came out. Aiden, it's me, Rekha cried, grabbing his hand. But his skin was ice-cold, lifeless. And then she heard it, the laughter. Low, guttural, and inhuman. It echoed through the chamber, filling the air with a sense of dread so powerful that Rekha felt her legs buckle beneath her. From the shadows, the same ghostly figure that had haunted Aiden began to emerge, its hollow eyes fixed on Rekha. It glided toward her, its twisted form moving unnaturally, as if the very laws of nature didn't apply to it. Rekha backed away, pulling Aiden with her, but he wouldn't move. His body was limp, as if the temple had already claimed him. The whispers grew louder, more violent, as the figure approached. The cold was unbearable now, and Rekha could feel her strength fading. She screamed for help, but the only answer was the mocking laughter of the spirit. Suddenly, the figure stopped, its hollow eyes locked onto her. It raised a hand, pointing directly at her, and for a moment, everything went silent. The air became still, the whispers ceased, and time seemed to stop. And then, with a deafening crash, the walls of the temple began to crumble. The ground beneath Rekha's feet trembled as the ancient stones cracked and fell. The spirit's laughter echoed through the ruins, and the last thing Rekha saw was the temple collapsing around her, its dark curse sealing her fate. No one from the village ever saw Rekha again. Years passed, and the story of the Paranormal Temple faded into legend. But the temple still stands, deep in the heart of the forest, waiting for the next soul brave enough, or foolish enough, to enter. They say that if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can still hear the faint whispers of those who were lost inside, calling out for help, trapped for all eternity. And the curse lives on as the years passed. The Paranormal Temple became a tale of caution told to children around campfires and whispered in hushed tones by the elders of the village. Yet, despite the countless warnings, the allure of the unknown continued to draw the curious, the brave, and the reckless. The village of Shyamgarh remained on edge, with the occasional sound of strange chants and eerie lights coming from deep within the forest. Some villagers claimed to see shadowy figures near the temple's entrance during the night, their glowing eyes watching from the tree line, only to vanish when approached. Others spoke of cold, icy winds that would sweep through the village, carrying faint voices pleading for release. One stormy night, a group of 4 thrill-seeking travelers, unaware of the temple's dark history, arrived in the village. They were photographers and explorers, documenting abandoned places and mysterious locations. Led by Anya, the fearless leader of the group, they heard rumors about the Paranormal Temple and decided it would be the perfect spot to add to their collection of haunted places. When they inquired about the temple at the village inn, the innkeeper grew pale, shaking his head. "No one who goes there returns," he warned, his voice trembling. "It's not a place for the living. That temple is cursed. The spirits that dwell there are angry, restless. Many have disappeared inside those walls, never to be seen again." But Anya and her group were undeterred. They thrived on danger, and the darker the legend, the more intrigued they became. Against the advice of the villagers, they made plans to visit the temple the following night. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew oppressive, as though the trees themselves were watching. The path to the temple was overgrown and treacherous, and a sense of unease settled over them. Yet, Anya pushed forward, convinced that the stories were nothing more than exaggerations. When the temple finally came into view, standing tall and ominous in the midst of the forest, even Anya couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine. The massive gates seemed to loom over them, the carvings of ancient deities and demons glaring down, warning them to stay away. But it was too late to turn back now. They had come for the thrill, and the thrill they would get. As they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped instantly, and the familiar whispers began. Anya and the others exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared speak. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the temple's stone corridors. The air felt thick with something they couldn't quite name, something dark, malevolent. They made their way through the temple's labyrinthine halls, taking photos and filming every eerie corner. But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. Anya's camera stopped working, its screen flickering with static. Tim, the tech expert of the group, tried to fix it, but the equipment refused to cooperate. Then came the voices, faint at first, but growing louder, echoing through the empty halls. They weren't whispers anymore, they were screams. The group huddled together, fear gripping them as the temperature plummeted even further. Their breath hung in the air like fog, and the darkness seemed to close in on them. Suddenly, the lights from their flashlights flickered, and in the dim glow, they saw it, figures, barely visible, moving through the shadows. The figures were twisted and distorted, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They seemed to float above the ground, moving toward the group. Panic set in, and they began to run, desperate to escape the temple's cursed walls. But no matter how far they ran, the halls twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the maze. The whispers became deafening, their own names being called in voices that didn't belong to any of them. One by one, the members of the group began to disappear. First Tim, who wandered off in a panic, his screams echoing through the halls. Then Sarah, who froze in terror as one of the shadowy figures reached out for her, pulling her into the darkness. Anya was left alone, trembling, her mind racing as she tried to find a way out. But the temple wouldn't let her go. The doors slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. She stumbled into the central chamber, where the altar stood, just as Aiden and Rekha had seen it. The stone was cold, the carvings glowing faintly in the dark. And there, standing at the far end of the chamber, was the figure. Its hollow eyes locked onto her, its body twisted and unnatural. Anya backed away, her heart pounding, but the figure only moved closer, its whispers filling the chamber. Suddenly, she heard a voice, a familiar one. It was Tim, calling her name, but it was warped, distorted, as though it came from another dimension. She turned toward the sound, but all she saw was darkness. Then, the figure was upon her. Its cold, dead hand reached out, brushing her cheek. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The walls of the temple began to collapse around her, the ground cracking beneath her feet. The spirit's hollow eyes bore into her soul, its laughter echoing in her mind, growing louder and louder until she felt she would go mad, and then, everything went dark. The villagers of Shyamgarh never saw Anya or her group again. Their names were added to the long list of those claimed by the Paranormal Temple, lost to its curse, their souls trapped within its ancient walls. To this day, no one knows exactly what evil lurks within the Paranormal Temple. Some say it was built to imprison an ancient demon, others believe the spirits of those wronged in life now haunt its halls, seeking revenge on anyone who dares to disturb their rest. But one thing is certain, those who enter the Paranormal Temple are never the same again, if they return at all.